Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to give you a quick crash course in behavioral science, and we're going to talk about some ways in which you can apply it in the resilience space. So as an exercise before we start, look at this picture, think about what it is, don't write your guess in the chat, and while you're thinking about what it is, you can share your name, your role, and where you're based in the chat. But remember, don't put your guess for this photo in the chat quite yet. We'll come back to this. So who are we? I'm Griffin Smith. My co-presenter is Skye King. We're both at Ogilvy, and we'll be taking you through the behavioral science presentation today. So we're about to rewire your brain, that photo we showed you in the first slide. So if you didn't guess what it is, one last chance now. So that photo is actually a frog. And now that you see it, it's obvious. And I'm sure some of you got that, but most people don't get it, that it's a frog. But now the fun part is, if you look back at the left photo, you can 100% see that's a frog, and you'll never be able to unsee the frog now. So your neurons have been rewired now. You understand this is a frog, and this is a fun mental quirk, a quick example of how behavioral science can be fun as well as useful. So what is behavioral science? There's a few technical definitions, but two ways we like to think of it on our team is one, simply how our thought processes interact with our external environments and how that interaction shapes our behavior and actions. You can also think of it as a formalized understanding that many ways we behave unconsciously, but the ways we behave unconsciously are often predictable. And we can take advantage of this kind of predictable unpredictability to support resilience behaviors and other actions, change behaviors, change resilience behaviors. So let's take a quick poll. What percentage of our daily decisions do you think we make subconsciously? So you can put A, B, C, or D in the chat. And I'm not going to give you the answer immediately, but I'll get back to it in a slide. So we have two systems by which we operate on. We have system one, and system one is fast, automatic, effortless. And this is the system by which we make most of our decisions. And then we have system two, which is slow, conscious, and effortful. And we only bring this in to make decisions some of the times. And system one, it's not perfect, but it makes sense to make most of our decisions. We're bombarded by so much information in our environment that we can't bring system two to making all of our decisions. So system one makes sense, but it also makes errors at times. And this is the answer. System one makes 95% of our decisions. 95% of our decisions are subconscious, but the way they are subconscious is often predictable. Because system one has to make so many decisions, it's making shortcuts, and these shortcuts often have errors. We call these errors cognitive biases, and there's over 200 which we have found so far. And we're going to talk about a few of these that are relevant to resilience. And before we get to those biases, one final fun way to think about behavioral science is cats and cucumbers. A few years ago, there was a trend of putting a cucumber behind a cat. There's lots of YouTube videos which you can find. When the cat sees the cucumber, it jumps away, and that's because we think the cat thinks it looks like a snake. And so you can think of behavioral scientists as thinking of humans are the cats and cucumbers are the context in our daily world. And we respond to things subconsciously like cats respond to cucumbers subconsciously. So now we're going to talk about a few common behavioral science barriers. We're going to explain what they are and talk about ways they can be relevant in your resilience work. And before we get to those barriers, just a quick note of caution. We're going to go over some barriers today, but it's worth confirming in a community that these are the barriers you're actually seeing. Context can affect the behavioral biases that are being seen, and different societal, cultural, economic conditions can affect the biases you're seeing. And sometimes there might not be a bias at all. Communities might be behaving perfectly rationally. So it's worth double checking and just not making that assumption that a community is definitely experiencing a behavioral bias. So first, we're going to cover 4 biases relevant to actions and habits. So first, mental scarcity. We can face financial scarcity, we can face temporal scarcity, we can face mental scarcity, and all these kinds of scarcity can strain our mental bandwidth. And what that means most of the time is we start tunneling. We only focus on a few key pieces of information in front of us, and this can be okay, but it also means we're missing other context around us, other solutions, other ideas, and this can prevent us from tunneling out of a problem. So an example in the resilience world is after people experiencing a flood, they are going to be exhausted. They're going to be financially strained. They're not going to have a lot of time. They will have experienced trauma, which will be further narrowing their mental mindset. And this could mean that they're not going to have the mental energy to think about building back resiliency, building back resiliently. So one of the solutions you can offer here is you can create mental slack. And there's different ways you can create slack, but this often looks like providing support, providing extra time, providing extra money, providing logistical help. So in the case of a post-flood situation, you could try to provide support that someone else is helping someone think of the solutions to build back more resiliently, and even more important, offering the funding and solutions to do that building back resiliently, so the person who's experienced the flood isn't having to do that work themselves. A fairly famous cognitive bias is called status quo bias, and in short, this just means we're more comfortable with what we know, even if another solution is better. So in the resilient space, a homeowner might choose not to purchase flood insurance, even if they're interested in it, just because they never have done so before. So there's a few different ways you can conquer this. You can reframe the choice. Instead of making purchasing flood insurance seem like a new choice, you can make an active choice, showing that not purchasing flood insurance is a choice in and of itself, as is purchasing flood insurance. So they're actually making a choice between 2 different choices. You can also make the new choice as easy as possible. How can you make buying flood insurance as easy, quick, as painless as possible? Another barrier, psychological distance. The further something is away from us, this can be real distance, this can also be time, or it can be mental distance, the less mental attention and weight we give something. We often see this in climate change work. Climate change seems distant, so it's more difficult for people to grapple with it. So a resilience example, a city might not implement new building codes because it hasn't been affected by hurricanes. Hurricanes just seem really mentally distant to this community. It doesn't seem like it'll impact them. So there are a few ways you can get over this. One, you can use some planning prompts. You can help the city kind of vividly plan what it might look like if they got hit by a hurricane and have them think about a planning method to confront this. You could also use vivid narrative frames and examples. In short, storytelling. Stories and case studies from other communities, especially similar communities, can be a very powerful tool here. You can share examples of a community that also thought it might be spared from a hurricane that actually was hit. And importantly, you can pair this with resilient strategies this community has taken to subsequently make itself more resilient. And the last barrier I'll go over here is hassle factors. And hassle factors are, in short, even small barriers in a process can cause people to give up at really high rates. You may have seen this in yourself. Maybe you're going through some sort of process on a website. They ask you to put in some information and you decide to drop off because putting in the information is just a little bit more work than you want. Well, this is also relevant in the resilience space. An example here, a homeowner who wants to install flood vents might decide not to just because they don't want to call a contractor to schedule a time to meet. This is a pretty small barrier, but it could be enough to stop the flood vents from getting installed. So here, it's all about simplification. How can you make the process as simple as possible? Maybe you can have the contractor call the homeowner and suggest 3 or 4 times to meet to install the flood vents. Skye's going to talk about this a bit more later, but you can also endow progress. Show that the homeowner has also made some progress. Make it clear that just by considering installing flood vents, they've already taken the first step. They're already on their journey. You can also make the next steps clear and actionable, making clear what will happen after they call the contractor, just demystifying the process. You can also customize the information as much as possible. Instead of giving people generic information, give them information about specific contractors in their area who can install flood vents. Pair that with grant and other resources they could use to offset the cost of these flood vents. So I'm going to give you one quick kind of guessing game based off of the biases we just covered and have you guess what bias you think this scenario is showing. So here, there's a community in rural Colorado. Its flood risks are increasing, mostly due to drier soil and an increased frequency of an intense rainfall events. And the community here, it's been introduced with a new solution, nature-based solution. And importantly, they're going to be cost-effective and effective. They're going to in alleviating flooding. However, despite being more cost-effective and effective, the town chooses to go with the same gray approaches it has in the past because that's what we've always done. So what bias do you think is going on here? You could put the answer in the chat. All right, so I'm sure some of you guessed it. B is the correct answer here. You're seeing a status quo bias. The community is going what it's always done just because that's what it knows. So as we discussed on the last slide, you could try to present it as two different examples here. It's not a new choice to go with nature-based solution. It's actually a choice to go with great infrastructure or nature-based solutions. Or you could even present nature-based solutions as the default choice, saying, this is what we think is best. Nature-based solutions are what we should go with. I mean, you could switch to gray infrastructure, but that would be switching from the default that we're suggesting. So those are some quick ideas that you could use for that scenario. And now I'm going to hand it over to Skye, who's going to take you through the rest of the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Griffin. So now what we'll cover are some barriers that focus on emotion and perception. So the first one we have here is optimism bias, which refers to that tendency for people to believe that positive events are more likely to happen to them than negative events like a natural disaster. And this also includes that even when that bad event happens, or even if it happens, folks believe that they're less likely to be impacted by that event than other people. So what happens here is this can lead to overconfidence. It can lead to an underestimation of risk. I think this is certainly one that many of us have encountered in the field. And what you see here in this example is we have a local business who has decided not to install those flood vents because they think they'll be fortunate, not impacted by flooding, even though they might be in a high risk area. So the question is, what do we do when we encounter this type of bias? So when folks have this optimism bias, one of the things we can ask them to do is to envision in advance what it might look like if everything doesn't go to plan, the sort of what if scenarios. This is also a great opportunity to showcase, case studies, share stories of other people or other groups or businesses like them who had similar notions, similar viewpoints, were overly optimistic perhaps, and then showing what they actually experienced and how they acted and hearing from those voices how they might have done something differently in the future. So a few tips there on for those of you who might encounter optimism bias in the field. The next one is confirmation bias, and I'll preface this by saying this is definitely one of the hardest nuts to crack in terms of the different behavioral barriers. So this is when we selectively seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. And we might, really wholeheartedly ignore or dismiss information that contradicts those beliefs. This leads sometimes to narrow-minded thinking, or it could lead to poor decisions. For instance, like not taking mitigation action because we're viewing it as too expensive to do. And just being aware of this bias can be really helpful, but then thinking about, this example here, what we're seeing in the real world is that, homeowners, for instance, who already believe flood insurance isn't necessary, they might be more likely to seek out and find the type of media coverage and examples that support that belief they already have. What we know about this is that throwing more facts and data and information at that person is not likely going to sway or change their behavior. So what does work in this instance? Well, we know that messengers and having messengers they trust can be a really big deal. Who are those that they might view as an authority on the matter? Somebody who they might have a lot in common with and sort of view themselves in, somebody they really feel is credible. So even, that person sharing their story, about how their mind shifted or changed over time can be really powerful. So that's where we're sort of showing some of those alternative examples and stories from those trusted messengers. And then the last thing we wanted to mention here is that, the goal, if somebody is expressing sort of confirmation bias, is not to try to change what they're thinking, but is to rather sort of frame and position things in terms of an evolution of views they already have, or sort of how can, we have this be viewed as a continuum of their life experience. So the third one we have here is on social norms or social proof. And that refers to the influence that behaviors and beliefs of others have on our own individual behavior and beliefs. So this is where people are often influenced by the actions of others around them. They might change their behaviors based on what they perceive as being the normal thing to do. You see this a lot in neighborhoods, in schools, in work settings, in social groups. And in this example, what we have is a town that doesn't see or hear about other towns near it adopting more stringent building codes. And if that's the case, that town might not be likely to adopt those building codes itself, right? So in this case, what you want to do is showcase some other comparison groups. Who are the towns that are undertaking this desired behavior, or the individuals who are taking on this particular action? In this case, is there a town or a group of places that might be viewed as being similar to them? And the trick is, even if it's not a town nearby, we can also look at, other towns they would view as part of their peer group. With this one, I also like to think, anytime you can infuse a little bit of healthy competition, often, local towns have sports teams that are competing and sort of other ways they're trying to, have that sort of healthy competition. So that can sometimes be an element you can tap into with resilience as well. So essentially, what you're helping to do is to create and highlight new norms that this town could emulate. And it's something that you can use throughout that journey and interaction with them. So the last barrier we're going to cover is invisibility behaviors. So this is when people perform actions automatically and unconsciously without thinking about them. And these behaviors can be difficult to change even when people are aware of them, because they're just so ingrained in your own habits and routines. And the other side of this is that other people can't see those behaviors either. So it's harder to establish what those social norms might be around you. So the common example I think of here is, you may have heard of examples where a water company will share your usage of water compared to your neighbors as a way to try to influence your behavior. In this example, what we see here is we're talking about a homeowner who doesn't flood-proof their house, or maybe they don't get insurance or other things because they don't see, their neighbors doing it, or it's just not something they have visibility into. So in this instance, there's an opportunity for us to encourage neighbors to share what they're doing. Maybe there are ways to recognize homeowners or give them awards, or sort of establish these types of conversations in neighborhood association meetings, who's doing it well. So these are opportunities that we can really harness, in terms of providing feedback and surfacing some of those behaviors. So now what I'd like to do is to turn us to another scenario and to test this knowledge. So if we're looking at this use case, can you identify what bias is present? So after a recent tropical storm, a homeowner in North Carolina wants to elevate their property. However, their house will be the first one in the neighborhood to be elevated. Homeowners have delayed moving ahead with work since they're worried about how their neighbors will react and what will happen. So please share in the chat if you think this is optimism bias, confirmation, social norm and proof, or invisible behaviors. I'll give you a second. All right, I'm guessing many of you got this one. It is it is letter C, social norms and proof is the example we're seeing there. All right, so great job. Now that you've harnessed a few additional skills in recognizing different types of bias, we're going to be focusing on how to use this knowledge even further to help communities and individuals along their resilience journey. So when we go to the next slide, you'll see there are some questions we like to think about, with our audiences when we're identifying whether behavior science or behavior tools might be helpful. So am I trying to reinforce, support, change of behavior? Do I want people to act? Do I want people to engage with my product or service or what I'm providing? Could there be human barriers to my desired outcome? Love this last one. Are humans involved? So, all right, I'll admit we got you there. The take-home message from this slide is that understanding barriers and using behavior science tools to address them is almost always going to be a hugely useful and powerful tool in your communications toolkit. So what we see in the next section is we've identified a couple of these different tools. Hopefully a lot of these should look familiar based upon some of the solutions we were discussing when we were walking through the different barriers. So public commitments, refer to commitments made by an individual in front of others. It's that purpose of increasing their accountability and motivation. I think you get a little bit of element of social pressure when you're making that public commitment, which we know makes people much more likely to follow through. So here's a great example. A lot of times this is a tool we use when we're working with community leaders, who are making a public promise to do something, like in this case, installing a new nature-based mitigation project. So endowing or showing progress is this idea that we're more likely to complete a goal or task if we feel we've already made progress for it. Griffin mentioned this earlier, and this might be saying something like, by reading this guide, you've already taken the first step in your resilience journey. Or in this example, we're showing homeowners the positive impact of their actions along the way. And we know that having a few of these steps already completed, sort of motivate and keep people taking action. For goal setting, this is where we're establishing those specific, measurable, actionable goals. Often this might be including deadlines. This is where we can work with individuals and communities to help prioritize their efforts. How are they going to track their progress? How are they going to keep motivated to take action towards that desired outcome? So this is where you might work with a community on a step-by-step plan to achieve a goal, like here, getting a CRS discount. So the last one we have here is the messenger effect. You heard this a couple of times, that the person delivering a message can have a significant impact on how it's received. So this is an important one to use and think about who is going to be most persuasive to the audiences you're targeting. So many of you might already be using these tools in your day-to-day work. In the next section, we're focusing on just a few additional tools that are really powerful for conveying information and persuading action. So identity priming is where we get that process of activating or emphasizing a particular aspect of one's identity. So, we might remind people that they're a responsible parent, and encouraging them to make different choices to protect their family or their community, can sort of tap into that. For change comparison group, this is where we're providing people with a reference group or comparison. I think you heard a couple of examples of that in the previous area. For example, instead of saying, or acknowledging there are no towns in the immediate area who have adopted codes, we might be tapping into the hundreds of communities that have similar characteristics to yours who have done X, Y, and Z. For descriptive norms, that is referring to behaviors that are commonly observed in particular social groups or communities. That can make providing information or descriptive norms really helpful. I think we heard a couple of different examples of that. This is also great when we're sharing, these where most people are already doing that positive norm. You can see the example here where 85% of folks are living in communities with mitigation plans. And then the last one here is really all about storytelling and narrative framing and sort of vivid examples. We know that those can be really powerful, and even from a neurological standpoint, right? Those tap into how our brain works. They build empathy and trust. They keep things engaging and memorable. So the use of real and authentic stories can be another powerful element. So with our last slide, these are just a few resources we thought you all might like in terms of boning up a little bit on behavior science, and check these out if you're looking for more information. But what we'd love to do is to actually open up to a few questions and maybe hear some examples from those of you who are participating. So thank you for your time today. And for those of you in our online session, you will now be joined to our live session where we can answer some of the questions you have. And if they're not answered today, please feel free to email me and Griffin, and we will be happy to connect with you then. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.